There is a special room for anyone who needs access to the deaf-blind Zoom. Please go ahead and take advantage of that room. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to HSLC, Heritage Sign Language Center. And we are focused on Black deaf gain, particularly in education. I am Candace Jones, and I am the director of the center and a third-year PhD student at Gallaudet University. I'm wearing a Black shirt with a white decoration on the front. I am a Black woman with gold hoop earrings and red lipstick. And I'm thrilled that you've joined us for this webinar today. If you want to know what the mission is of HSLC, you see a picture here of the various panelists, and two of them are blank because we have two special guests who will share about their experiences as they were students growing up, Black and deaf. The mission of the Heritage Sign Language Center is to have a lens on the family, education, and community of Black deaf students. The community includes people of all ages, from birth to senior citizens, from a variety of different races, ethnicities, Black, Latin, Asian, and white people who serve as allies that work to dismantle systems of oppression. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists, four Black deaf scholars and researchers, particularly in deaf education. So, only 1% of Black deaf students are graduating with degrees. And so that's part of why we're here today, to focus on the educational needs and what's going on. So now I will be introducing our future doctoral scholar, Miss Akila English.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Akila English. I'll give a description of myself. I'm wearing a white shirt. I'm a Black woman. I have gold hooped earrings and I'm wearing glasses. I have a gray background and I'm really excited to be with you today.
Beautiful. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Gloshander Lawyer.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Gloshonda Laurier. I'll give an image description. I'm a Black female. I have a few piercings in my nose, in my lip, and in my ear. I have braids currently. I have a Black jacket. And I also have the Tree of Life tattooed on my chest. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you for describing your tattoo as well. And now I will introduce Dr. Rez Tazai Mogus Rydell.
Hello, all. I'll give an image description. I have a white shirt. I have a tie. It's like a burnt orange color. I also have a hat that matches the color on the tie. I have a
I am a female presenting in a masculine presenting body.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Onadea Nicolaricus.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Onudea Nicolaricus, and I sign my name with an O on my shoulder. I'm biracial, a deaf woman. I have got caramel skin, curly black hair, black glasses, a black t-shirt, and red lipstick, and a cream wall with a small picture frame above my head. Before I go ahead and give more introduction and go through the questions for the panelists, we will talk a little bit about what's going on. They will share their professional background and experiences, their accomplishments, and what your areas of study are. And we'll have a bit of personal touch to discuss the things that you enjoy in your free time.
Hello, everyone.
I
Again,
work as, oh, sorry, go right ahead.
I'm assistant professor at California State University in Long Beach. CSUN is in Northern California, and I'm in Southern California. I'm also a part-time professor at Gallaudet University. I am engrossed in a number of research topics, looking at Black Death Gain as one of those topics. I also have a body of research looking at those areas of lack. And that is what has given me the ambition to dive into this specific topic. I think about the intersections that I hold as an African immigrant, and also seeing a lot of the content that is published that isn't about our communities. And so looking at the research in terms of the missionalization of those groups, and making sure we can include all members of those groups. That's where my passion started. Also looking at linguistic anthropology as well, looking at how those cultures and languages intersect. And that brought me to where I am here today, and why I am looking forward to having this discussion about Black Death Gain. Knowing what's happening here in America, historically, it isn't often discussed, but definitely we've had some literature reviews that have some information in terms of some of the work that we're doing, but we're looking right now to center thoughts and discussions on the work that we're doing, looking at those critical race theories as well, and how those intersections work with those discrit and the disability critical theories. Really, what about me? What do I like to do hobby-wise? I'll just say that I am an avid collector of lesbian pop fiction. I love a lot of those paperbacks from the 1930s, I would say, for the 1960s. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
So, our next presenter. Currently, I'm working as a deaf and hard of hearing specialist with the DC public school system. And I focus on coaching and supporting different programs within the District of Columbia. And I've worked in deaf ed for 17 years. I am now currently a doctoral student at the University of Maryland and looking at Black deaf students and how they navigate through the deaf education system, what happens with them in terms of being dehumanized. And I am in the middle of my doctoral, writing my dissertation, and my goal is to be completed in December. This work is much needed. It's a much needed conversation about how we can create students, how we can create a space that affirms and thrives what our students are up to. I like being outdoors. And I am also a fan of shoes. I collect shoes and have over 150 different pairs of favorite shoes.
Hello, everyone. I was a professor and teacher of deaf ed and deaf studies. I'm also an interpreter. I have since started doing work as an independent researcher and consultant, looking at the educational system for deaf and hearing individuals and giving that support that they need in terms of their education for, by deaf people, deaf blind people. And also, I'm a co founder of an organization that's called Myers and Lawyer. And we focused on BIPOC interpreters, their development, resource dissemination for them as well, and looking at, again, work for us and by us for our community. Looking at education, interpreters, interpreting, multicultural individuals, deaf blind individuals, a whole cadre of individuals, just making sure that they all have access is something that I'm interested in doing. My hobby, I would say, is developing new areas to research, looking at themes, theories, concepts, thinking about different methods that I can follow to go through the processes, setting up these things for myself, just taking my own journey throughout this path. I love dancing, roller skating. I love getting piercings, as you can probably see today. But I'm looking forward to having this discussion with all of you. And next up, we'll have Dr. Oni.
Well, I was born in New York, and you may see some regional signs and may see me signing fast. So I will do my best to sign more slowly. I went to deaf schools in New York. I was mainstreamed in high school for 4 years with interpreters. And then I came to Gallaudet University and became a teacher for K through 12. And I decided I really was itching and wanting to go back and do my doctoral studies. And I decided I wanted to fix the system for deaf ed in K through 12. There were many things that students were struggling with, particularly Black deaf students and students of color. And I realized that the system was broken and what was going on in the classroom wasn't working. So I decided to undertake my doctoral studies in the Department of Education at Gallaudet, and I am now a faculty member there. I'm also focused on writing, and many deaf students struggle with writing. And mine is really talking about how deaf people can write, but they have their own way of writing and how that can even meet or exceed what is considered written English. I'm looking at systemic issues and injustices within the education system. And my areas of interest and my hobbies, really, there are two things. I love backpacking solo, and I've actually been to 6 different continents. And I'm sure you could guess which is the seventh one I haven't visited yet. And I like playing with my daughter and see her language develop as I expose her more and more. So those are my two areas of interest outside of research.
Awesome. Thank you to our panelists for letting us know a little bit about the work you do, what you enjoy, and learning more about you. Next slide, please. I'll call up next Dr. Mogs, who will talk a little bit about an item that was published during her dissertation doctoral studies. It was in the Justice Court article for social change about race and ethnicity in higher education. When it was published, a lot of people dealt with a lot of frustration. But we look to Black Deaf Gain and how Black Deaf Gain can help us in this process to develop a lens from a historical perspective. This was published in 2020 by Dr. Mogs. And I wanted to ask you the reason why you did this. What were you interested in when you researched this and came up with this title?
Well, I'm really thrilled to be here with this panel and to discuss this issue, and it's a much needed frame. I wrote this paper really before I had even considered going on and getting my ED degree. And my specific studies and the criteria for that, as I mentioned before, I was so frustrated with certain articles and where people talked about deaf culture. And if they ever talked about Black deaf people, there was so little attention paid. And I felt we are so important. Where were our struggles? Where were our history? Where were the contributions of Black deaf people in deaf history as well as in American history in general? And I knew I needed to do something about that. And I knew I could wait for someone, but I also knew that if it was up to it, if it was to be, it was up to me. And so I looked at what was going on in Black deaf history, in education, looking at culture, and I couldn't find any places where these different areas were crossing one another. And so I wanted to look at different history related to critical race theory using a deaf lens. And when I did research, I realized deaf critical theory, I knew it was something that needed to exist, but I realized it also was not there. And when we look at this idea of the critical lens, we knew that it needed to be there. But I also realized that the Black deaf experience had been erased once again when we looked at deaf critical lens. And so I knew something needed to be done. And I wanted to figure out where it could be published. I had already focused on having things published previously to this, and there were some chapters and other papers, and I had been experienced with publication, but I had never had an opportunity to see formal research with particular issues be focused on. And I knew we had to pass the IRB to get this published. And I wanted to know what my approach would be so that it could be handled well. And I realized that there was nothing available yet. But then there was one publication that was looking for submissions. And I thought that what I was writing would be a perfect piece for that publication. And it was called Deaf Empowerment. And it was by two educators, one male and one female, one hearing and one hard of hearing. And I thought it would still be a good place to talk about Black Deaf Gain. And I decided to pack everything I could into that potential publication. they asked me to make some modifications to it, and I had to go back and forth with them and really fight for it to say what I wanted to say because they wanted me to remove critical race theory. And they said that it really wasn't the best approach for this level of publication. And I thought to myself, that did not absolutely make any sense whatsoever. I realized I had finished my master's degree, and if I wanted to take advantage of the privileges within academia, I needed to think about critical race theory and reframe it from what had been considered up until that point. Often people tended to look with a pathologized view of the Black experience. So I really wanted to shift that lens. And I decided to move away from deaf empowerment and decided to go to another journal and realized that this new journal, this digital journal, was going to be someplace where I could find a home. And there were scholars of color, plus other deaf scholars of color involved. And I submitted really basically the exact same article, even with some trepidation. And I realized that the experience that they had been talking about was not the only one that had been focused. It had been a very Eurocentric approach. And I wanted to see how we could shift from a Eurocentric valued approach and make it something that included more people and not just cisgendered, able-bodied white people. So, of course, I had some I wasn't sure about whether it was accepted or not, but I was able to work with other people on the publication, and I realized this was the right direction. And that paper was published. And sometimes, as an author, you have to let go when you send something in for publication. So I was excited that it was accepted. Thank you very much.
We definitely honor you for your work and thank you for setting the stage as we talk about this lens that we're looking at today. Often, our Black deaf history is not included in scholarship. And I appreciate that you mentioned that article and what happened to capture the attention um, of an individual who was focused on work in this community. And so that was a first Black deaf teacher, thinking as this person also who was involved in sports as well, knowing his wisdom, knowing what he imparted to the community, and to have a film about him is something that's very important when we talk about this topic of Black deaf game. Thinking about the students who were forced in a matter of oralism. Next up, we have a video that's about a minute or so. We would ask you, audience, to sit back, relax, take a look at the video, and see what our speaker has to say to us about his educational experience.
May I have the next slide, please? If you talk about Black Deaf Game, that was really fascinating. So that's where we have a research team who has recently published an article called Black Deaf Game, a guide to revisioning K through 12 deaf education. And I'm using their work in my dissertation as well because often we see Black and Brown students who have been oppressed by many in many different ways. And there may be information that you've never seen before, like autism and sexism, but within deaf education of Black and Brown students, you will see more information that they will share. And we've got the research team that consists of soon to be Dr. Akila, Dr. Ani, and Dr. Gloshanda. And the three of them came together and have framed and will discuss what led them to talk about this particular method that they have come up with in terms of epistemology. What's inspired them? Will it be all of us or just me? I'm not clear.
Related to this particular pedagogy, oftentimes when we're in school, students enter the classroom, the teacher already has their curriculum established, and what they plan to teach the teachers is strongly rooted into a white lens. And also in deaf schools as well, they have a deaf white lens that is taught to students as well. But what about those students who are primarily Black and people of color in the classroom? What about their experience? What about their culture? Oftentimes, it's not brought into the classroom. Their culture is often marginalized. And so we were thinking about how we could re-envision and redesign this for Black deaf students, making sure that the pedagogy that is brought forth considers these students and encourages them as well and encourages those teachers as well to teach curriculum that includes the students, making sure that you talk about Deaf President Now only as an option, talking about the Clare Center, talking about Gallaudet University, and American School for the Deaf. All of these topics are white centric, but what about showing them another view? Only showing them about oralism and talking about those specific topics, looking at one particular language. But how can we help those Black deaf students preserve Black ASL and their signing system and modalities? We want to make sure that they are incorporated in the process and that everything is not whitewashed and doesn't include them. And so that's part of what we're looking at in our educational curriculum, making sure we maintain this momentum and including culture more. So I hope I explained it a little more clearly and you'll know where we were coming.
Now, related to what Dr. Ani just said, we realized that it wasn't just a binary, white and Black, but also there were other layers that needed to be included in our identities. We wanted to think about GAIN in terms of pedagogy and how to support Black Deaf GAIN. And there was such a diversity of identities in terms of deaf-blind, deaf-disabled people, people who had been marginalized, and people who had been in deaf schools, who had been in mainstream programs. But how could we focus on the different identities? Because it was important for them to have teachers and instructors who would be able to center their identities for them from a positive viewpoint. And that was very critical about how we could contribute to that for Black deaf students. And by when we say Black deaf, we mean deaf disabled, having all members of the Black deaf community be represented and included in the curriculum decisions, in the environments.
I'll briefly add to what Dr. Oni and what Dr. Laurier already mentioned. The three of us came together and we definitely realized that Black deaf students have been negatively impacted and have a negative perspective in terms of identity from a historical context. And we wondered how we could use the strength of what they have and bring that into the classroom to incorporate their stories, their experiences, and to honor who they are. We wanted to reframe the frame that was already put there, intentionally analyze curriculum, looking at the background of those students, looking at the broad diversity that exists within our culture and identities. And all of this inspired us to step away a little bit and take a bird's eye view to look at how we can avoid really marginalizing our community and making sure that members of the community are spotlighted. Like Dr. Laurier mentioned as well, looking at deaf blind individuals, hard of hearing individuals, late deafened individuals. Our intention in this article was to spotlight the diversity of the community, and not only for our Black deaf students, but thinking about the multiculturalism that exists within our communities as well. Not only Black students, but
There's some significant terms that many of you may not have ever seen before. And you don't have access to the article yet, but we will show you a slide that lists some of this terminology. Next slide, please. And you can see some of these terms there. And these terms have been included and used. And if you're wondering what the meaning of them are, some of them may not have specific signs at this point. So if each of you could maybe take a couple of the terms and describe them a little bit further. So we've got ableism, anti-Blackness, autism, intersectionality, essentialism, universalism, linguicism, and distancism. Would you mind, each of you, taking a couple of these terms and unpacking them a bit for our audience?
I'll go ahead and start. I'll start with two terms. Obviously, because my doctoral studies was focused on anti-Blackness. That's one of the things that's really personal to me. When I think about race and think of oppression, specifically for people of color, the anti-Blackness is against marginalizing Black individuals in society, in educational spaces, and realizing that these individuals are not included. They are marginalized merely because they have Black bodies. Think about George Floyd's death as one example of anti-Blackness, and how that happened because he's a Black man. Thinking also about distancism, looking at how some individuals who are deafblind do want to use protactile for communication. They're like, no, I don't want to communicate like that. That's a form of discrimination because you don't want somebody that close in your space. So those are the two words that I'll sum up with.
So I'll talk about intersectionality. Often people twist this or use it in different ways, but I want to make sure that intersectionality It's not meaning that one identity trumps another, but if someone who is born, all of us have some intersectional identities. It can be related to race, somebody who's Latin, someone who is white. My biracial experience can be included this. I'm from a hearing family, and my family is a very strong spoken language family. I learned sign language later in life, and all of those are part of my identities. I also grew up in a impoverished class, and so money and education, those were a part of my identity. I have an experience of going to deaf residential schools as well as mainstream schools. So all of those are a part of who I am. And I can't just pluck one of those identities out and choose to focus on it because all of these are pieces of my lived experience and make up who I am. So hopefully that clears up more information about intersectionality. Now I'll talk about linguicism. Often language in writing, people will say, English is not so great. I grew up as a deaf person. We should focus on somebody who has better English skills than I do. And that's something that has often come into play, or people have adopted that mindset based on that people that have educated them. But within the deaf community, we also have linguicism because we have people who say that ASL should have a particular way of being presented. And that if it doesn't include those features, then it's not considered pure ASL. And that's a form of linguicism as well, because there's a hierarchy of language purity. And that's what linguicism really refers to.
This is Dr. Laurier. You all have given great explanations. I'd like to earn the tab. Essentialism is one term that I will add. And Dr. Ani already explained about intersectionality, but this is the opposite of that particular term. You don't say that you're a Black deaf or that you're a Black Latin. You just say that there is one deaf experience, and you may not recognize a person's Black deaf identity. You may not recognize that the person is a member of a particular community, not thinking about how they grew up, how they raised, how they function. You think about deafness first, and really extensionalism is detaching yourself from all of your other identities. But again, as she mentioned before with intersectionality, we think about all those identities we share and focused on our Black experience, our deaf experience, and not ignore those others. But in essentialism, as I mentioned before, you only focus on um, that one identity. The next term I'll use is universalism, is thinking that all individuals and their experiences are the same, that you can use the one type of curriculum and it should be appropriate for all of your students. If you think that that curriculum is centered on a particular group, as I mentioned before, it can meet the needs of all of the students, lacking the diversity that's necessary to meet the needs of the students. And that's something that we've traditionally done. And so we have to honor the experiences of individuals and not use one approach of universalism, but use an approach that includes individuals.
I'll focus on ableism. And if we talk about ideas of who is able-bodied, ableism can go under the same umbrella, and it's got some specific issues related to it. Identities related to that, what the needs are, for example, that are impressed. If we talk about distancism, that can go under the umbrella of ableism as well as autism, because that umbrella encompasses many different ways that people are oppressed based on their body. As the three have mentioned before me, we have intersectional identities related to ableism as well. Autism typically is oppression related to someone's ability to hear or not hear, and sometimes it can include people's speech abilities or not being able to speak a particular way. There also is a focus on someone being able to speak fluently and being able to speak in ways that other people can hear, having hearing abilities, and being able to operate from a dominant culture perspective. Having the ability to hear and provide access based on that ability falls in that category as well.
Thank you all for your description of those terminologies to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know there were a few that we didn't discuss. We do have a few questions that we would like to pose to our panel, and thinking about how we can support our professors in pedagogy and what we can do. Of course, there is not enough diversity in the match of professors that match the student. You'll see in Lawyer's publication where they talked about deaf education and how those individuals did not receive what they needed. Looking at the performance of the students, the identities of the students. And so we have questions that we would like to pose to our panelists, because we realize that what has happened traditionally is something that continues to happen. We would like to see more diversity in deaf education, how language is used, including our intersections, not only thinking about our deaf identities, but thinking of.
I always say to people, if we look back, well, this is Dr. Ani speaking. Let me back up. If we look back to our childhood, to your teachers, who you bonded with the most, who were those people? What were their backgrounds? Were they similar to yours? Did they have similar interests? Maybe they looked similar to you. Maybe there was some reason in the family. Often we want to think about someone who we valued. We can be learn from those people and be motivated by them. But if I'm often learning from people who don't look like me, then I may have a hidden message that I'm not ever going to be as good as they are, that they are always going to be better than I am. And often, in terms of representation, teachers who look like the students they're teaching and have intersectional identities similar to the students that they are teaching can help those students to become more successful. And it allows those students to think that they can be successful and achieve their goals. In terms of resources, we need to see the resources that are available and what we can become. And those have an impact. For me, most of the teachers I saw were white. I don't actually remember a Black deaf teacher at all. And I thought to myself, the people who succeed in life are white people. They may have been deaf people from deaf families. And I always felt my identity as someone who did not come from a deaf family meant that I was not who I needed to be. And I often would hide my identities in those situations. But it's important. We have to continue to break down those harms and create more and more teachers of color so that students can see themselves and see themselves represented. Dr. Glow?
Dr. Ani, thank you. This is Gloshonda signing. I definitely treasure my experience. I definitely had a different experience. I grew up in a hearing environment as a hard of hearing person. And in that hearing environment, a number of the instructors were Black. They were older, experienced teachers from a number of countries. They either were from Europe and immigrated here to the United States. And at that time, almost all of my teachers were Black. You know, I didn't, of course, exist in a hard of hearing space and wasn't connected with that identity yet. But culturally, in the Black identity, I was connected. And so I struggled a little bit with my identities, kind of like Dr. Oni mentioned. It's about achieving those goals, and you think that white success is success, but not realizing the Black experience of hearing people and how they succeeded, looking at them. But when we think about Black Deaf Gain, we definitely would like to look at this particular construct and keep these things in mind so that we're conscious of what's happening in the community for people of color, for people who look like us. Valuing that culture, valuing the language is definitely important. But how can we better support our Black deaf students? Because there is a gap and they are not getting the full experience as they should. They should have access to a number of community members. And how we envision the educational system is a disconnect, you know, from the community and from the family. I think the educational system should partner with the family and with the community to make sure that those Black deaf students as a child have that experience and are also able to gain from including all of their identities, including curriculum as well, inviting individuals in the classroom, giving them those benefits of that experience is something that you can't take away from them. And having that collective approach, I think is also important for when we're teaching our children, making sure that we look at those lenses, you know, including everyone in this process, I think will help to uplift those Black deaf students as you connect them with the community.
These have been wonderful examples about seeing people who looked like oneself. And when I was growing up, I had no deaf teachers. I found out that deaf people could get a PhD when I was about 23. And in that way, I became a late bloomer. I had no idea I would become a professor. I felt some shame around being a Black deaf person. And I wish I had known what I know now much sooner in my life. So the majority of deaf faculty members of color, they were Black. And when I looked at their stories and their narratives, I was heartbroken to listen to what had happened to them, how they wanted to see themselves represented, but they weren't. And that had them to choose to become doctors and educators. And I'm doing the same thing for future generations. I'll turn it over now to Akila.
Well, I have a few minutes left in this segment. I'll just quickly share my experience. I agree with what Dr. Glow said, what Dr. Ani said, and also Dr. Moog's. Thinking about the system and systemic um, views and perspectives, we think about the infamous formal education of deaf students started in 1870s. That was probably around the first time, but Black students were not forbidden to go to that school until 30 years or so later. And so thinking about the system and looking at a white-based system, what happened with those Black deaf students? Those Black teachers came from HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. They were educators who were educated in those HBCU settings, and they were the ones who led and forced the work of immigration. Because definitely, I would say my experience was more of experience of white teachers. And of course, they maintained the status quo. There was no representation. And so when we think about over 200 years or so, there was no representation, there was no clear knowledge of what was happening, and Black deaf bodies were not included as well. Think about the cases that have happened years ago. We were not included. And so now in 2024, we are still struggling definitely with many processes and many credentialing systems because a lot of things are integrated within the white community who has the control over things. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we need to look back at the system and systemically to see that things were designed and they were not designed to include us from the get-go.
It's really heartbreaking that this issue is perpetuated over these years. I went to the Center for Black Deaf Studies symposium last year, which was an amazing event. And there were many presenters there, and we had interviews with people, Black deaf people from all over, and asked them if they had had any educators in their journey from elementary school, high school, college, people young and old, and many of them said they had never, ever, ever had a Black deaf teacher, and it was heartbreaking. We know that children deserve to have people that look like them, Black, deaf, young, people who come from intersectional experiences, because it allows them to be able to thrive in deaf education. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. Can you show question? If you all can talk about how in 2024, we know we don't have enough teachers and we can't change those statistics overnight, but what can we do now to address these common issues? How can we use this framework and what can teachers use within the framework in the classroom? How can they apply that? Can you briefly talk about that? And we'll talk about our two panelists who can share about their experiences growing up in Black deaf schools in their K through 12 educational experience. So when we look at, there are four tenets of education. I want to jump to the fourth tenet, which talks about the narrative. If we talk about the Black identities and look at the deficit that's there in the educational curriculum, we've got to find ways to create a motivation and what's happening in terms of the lenses in our community that white people have never seen or never bothered to investigate. And we've got to find ways to make sure that our students of color feel empowered. And that's what I noticed, that we've got a duty to fight and preserve this and really build up and create an equitable educational system. And I'd like to turn it over to one of our other scholars to respond to this inquiry as well.
Hi, this is Dr. Ani speaking. Yeah, I would say that we mentioned several examples in our writing for K to 12 educational settings about the importance of narratives, kind of like Dr. Raisnet Mose Radell mentioned as well, thinking about the intersections of our community, looking at our elders and their storytelling, including those narratives, are some of the tools that we can use. I think some of those scholars and scholarships have that information, social media, using those images that we see online, um, incorporating those tools into our curriculum, searching for those tools that would go. I know it would be nice if we had a central place to go to have the media, have the different videos that we can use and incorporate in our instruction. Language preservation is another issue we should look into as well. Looking at Black ASL, how we can have a number of examples to share, explaining the history, language, and culture. And there are a number of examples that we can consider and how we can apply them in the classroom.
I absolutely agree with what has been shared. And I also want to focus on what Dr. Ani mentioned earlier about intersectionality. We have to be more intentional to include these lenses within the classroom. If we've got deaf training programs with a deaf perspective, it typically is a white deaf perspective. It's strongly focused on American Sign Language and spoken English, and it comes from a white perspective and all of that. And we have to be intentional to consider whose story is being erased and which identity has been erased and ignored, and how we're going to intentionally include those identities that have been excluded. Oftentimes, we think about how we can design our classrooms, how we can design our curriculum from a deaf perspective, and think about that as one lens, but that's dangerous. We have to think about things from a multiplicity of views when we're making decisions.
This is Gloshonda speaking. Thinking about the students, they are our resource. I think if we look to them as an example of how we can use their knowledge and take from them to take the information that they have and bring it into the resources that we use in the classroom. I think the teachers could benefit from learning from the students. Don't discount their experience, but include their experiences and their journeys, their language view, their worldview, their environment, whether it be deaf, hearing culture, Black culture, all of that diversity that the students bring within, bring those things into the classroom. Noticing that those students have the ability to interact and code switch with whatever community they are connected with, but I would say inviting them to share their knowledge in the space and thinking about what they can offer as a resource. I think the best thing that a teacher or professor can do in these spaces is be open to their students, thinking about their knowledge that they have and wondering how you can bring this knowledge forward.
These are wonderful examples about how we can apply this in the classroom and create diversity and inclusion to make sure that every student's need is met. So now, next slide, please. I'd like to introduce two guest panelists who will be joining us now. Our first one is Antonice Davis, Nunu. Nunu, if you could come on screen, please.
Can everyone see me okay? Hello, everyone. I'm Nunu. I'm Antony's. My background is an orange colored wall. I'm a Black female with a black shirt on. I have glasses. I have braids and a head wrap on.
And our next panelist was a former student of mine, and I taught this student in elementary, middle school, and high school, and now primarily I was really honored to teach this young man, and now he's a student at Gallaudet University. Menelik Tavares, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Menelik. I have on a gray shirt that has a Gallaudet emblem on the pocket. I have glasses, a beard and mustache. I have locks, and I'm happy to be here.
So I've got a couple of questions I want to pose to you all. If you can look back on your education, did you have any teachers who looked like you, who had language like you, Or did you wish that you had more teachers in your K through 12 educational experience who looked like you?
So I would have to say a little bit about my experience. I went to Maryland School for the Deaf in Frederick, Maryland. I graduated in 95. And then I went to Bear School in Baltimore. It wasn't a good school. My parents moved me to a school in Columbia, Maryland. And when I was in that school in Maryland, a number of the students came from Baltimore. But when I look back, I remember that um, I felt like we played more than we learned. I feel like we were language deprived in that space as well. I grew up in a hearing family. And so most of my experience was centered around white individuals. But then when I went to the Maryland School for the Deaf in Frederick, I would have to say in Columbia, it was primarily a white student body. And in Frederick, there was one Black professor. In my
Home
home
economics.
economics class.
Mhm.
And to be honest with you all, I wish that there were more Black deaf teachers that taught general ed courses. But just to have that one teacher in a home economics course, I felt was not enough. There was a lack. I felt that I was severely behind as a result of that. And also, I would say as a deaf person, learning language, learning to communicate, I didn't do as well academically. I struggled a bit in the classroom. I felt like I needed more instruction, but it seemed like the level of instruction kind of remained the same for me. If I would ask my teachers if I could have additional assignments, um, they wouldn't give them to me because they said I wasn't doing it well enough. They said, you're doing good enough, and that's all that you need to do. But I'm like, if I'm doing well, that really isn't enough. And they were just looking for me to just pass along and graduate and get me out of their classroom. And that was in 1991. I felt like at that point when President Obama came on the scene, 91, 93, around that time, I felt like I was really motivated to learn. But I looked for Black deaf educators. I wondered where they were. Who were they teaching? Because I felt like those eyes were not attending to me. And the Black deaf teachers only taught home ec. Maybe that's what they thought that only Black students could do, was more of a technical skill. And they maybe thought that we can learn from them in that space. But I wanted to learn more about Black history, Black culture, and that information was not available to me. And so really, I would say that the knowledge that I have, I've learned from what I've seen from members of the community. But I think that we have to stop what we've been doing and do something different.
Well, I went to school, as Candace mentioned, in Atlanta, and most of my teachers were white until I went to middle school and I started to see, excuse me, some Black staff and Black teachers, and they were more visible, people who looked like me and people who were deaf. And I found out that there were Black deaf teachers because they were not just assistant teachers or staff, but they were actually teachers. And as I progressed through the school, people said that there were more and more people, and I didn't start seeing them until later, seeing people who looked like me, and it would have been nice if they had been visible sooner as I was progressing through my education. I was able to connect with the with Reginald Bass and with Candace so that I could learn more from them. And then there were also teachers who could hear, but not Black deaf. And to be honest, seeing these Black deaf teachers and having them be more visible, it would have been nice to be able to see more of them. So we could understand that we could possibly become teachers in the future as well. But as I did go through the school, I was able to see them, and that helped me in my plans.
Thank you for sharing your educational experiences and a little bit about your background. I have a follow-up question for you in terms of curriculum. Thinking about the curriculum that has been old and not updated, of course, there are changes that are necessary for curriculum, but for your view, what do you think? Do you believe that if you incorporate specific elements of Black culture into the curriculum, would it positively impact students' performance in these educational settings?
Well, in my opinion, I think it definitely would have an impact on these students because it would help them to understand their identity better and to see what a Black deaf person can do and what can happen in a mainstream environment. It would help them to be proud of themselves and to know that they're in a world where Black deaf people are able to be successful and to understand themselves and their community a lot better. You know, our identities are so strongly connected to our history. And I think if we could have more educators who are Black and deaf in the schools, particularly for younger children, it can help them to see what's possible. And as they get to be older, they can then advocate for what they need if they see that they aren't getting it. And any barriers they faced in terms of the isms, they'll be more strongly equipped to be able to address them.
I would agree with what you just said 100%. Thinking about individuals who gain from knowledge in the books. Where is Black history? Where is our history? Most of that history is not related to us. If we see ourselves printed in books, definitely that would cause students to be more interested. And if you had Black deaf professors, oh my goodness, I think the students would excel. They could probably excel beyond their counterparts. I have no doubt about that. You know, I'm 58 right now, and I think that I started probably around the age of 33, 34, looking deeper into these things. But the younger children right now, I'll say that they're starting off with some sense of game. But there is one thing that I definitely want all white schools for the deaf to remember if they have these Black students, realizing that they have potential. We have scholars here on the call with us today. And so that you can see that those BIPOC students can do the work that they need to do. They just need the motivation, and you're responsible for motivating them. It's not that hard. And if you believe that you can do that, that's something that you should do.
I agree with what each of you have said. I became deaf at 3 years old. I was born hearing, and I became deaf as a result of spinal meningitis. And I went to Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, and it was a culture shock for me because I was used to talking. And as our video showed earlier, there were some teachers who signed, and I didn't know what was going on. Fortunately, I had some Latin teachers as well and people with intersectional identities. And I really didn't have as much of an opportunity to connect with deaf students until I came to Gallaudet University. And I didn't see any Black deaf teachers even at Gallaudet right away. And it wasn't until I met Dr. Khadija Rashid Kubi, who was a Black deaf woman. That was the first Black deaf person I had seen. And as a Black deaf person, my identity was much more associated with being Black, because that was how people saw me. But I wanted to ask you all, from your perspective, what kind of things happened that allowed you to learn about the lived experiences of Black deaf people? What kinds of things do you think we need to do better that can help people understand how to be better for Black deaf students?
Well, from my perspective, and I would say providing access because that's critical. In the world that we live in, you want to see those students develop. And so if you provide them access to culture and history, I think those students will gain in that respect. As a Black man navigating space, I can learn how to do so. Building those concepts of self, helping the student learn how to be and present themselves in space, giving them choices. And like, for example, there are a few things that I would like to offer. Thinking about those students and how if they're in a space where everyone looks like them and they have that representation, they feel connected. Encouraging the students to take the lead, to be innovative and creative in the process, helping them to come together and support one another, having curriculum and content that is related to them, that will hold their interest in the classroom, looking to them, being interested in them, and pulling out the things in them to discuss in the classroom. And so don't limit the resources that are available to you. The students are there right in front of you. And like Nunu said already, think about all of those deaf scholars that we have on the call today. You can be a deaf scholar too, realizing if you have the support. So looking at those perspectives are important.
I want to be honest with you all and straight down the middle. I'm going to keep it 100. I've heard tell of many deaf schools, white deaf schools, of course, where there are Black teachers. There aren't many. There are many Black, Indigenous, and people of color students. How can we protect and preserve those students? Are those, where is that conversation being had? If these students had strong leadership to be able to believe in their ambitions, it would all start from there. But how is that going to start? And where will it start? And I really can't talk about this question, to be honest with you, because, as Menelek just said, sure, we'd like to see it happen, but it's not happening because there's so much work to do. We have to work so hard to be able to meet the needs of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color students. And I'm really conflicted about this, to be honest. I don't even know how to respond.
I definitely want to add comment about the role of individuals who are BIPOC is key. If I'm a Black person and I see a Black person succeed, then that would inspire me. Looking at how a person is inspired, thinking about those role models that are available for them to look up to is something that can help them.
I agree with that 100%. And research has proven that if representation is there, students thrive. And they progress on to higher education and get bachelor's, master's, and PhDs. These students, and me included, have been able to find our identities when we see people that look like us, particularly Black deaf people, related to our clothes, our culture, our language, our everything. This is something that I've been able to pass on to students who have come behind me, but we do have some questions from our audience, and I'd like to be able to engage in those questions. And there are just a few of them, and we are going to wrap up right on 1:30. So we've got about 10 minutes. And we're going to have our interpreter, Richie Bryant, come on screen to sign the questions for us. Richie? Our first question is from Yvonne Black. And she says, we know that Black and Brown deaf children have not been getting high school diplomas, even though they've made it all the way through their education. But what steps do schools need to be held accountable to amplify the Black deaf gain? When they graduate and get these diplomas, what are we going to do to make sure that they get what they need?
I have one answer to that. I would say mentorship. You need to assign to them like a big brother, big sister, big person, an individual who can mentor them. Because oftentimes, if you see someone in a position, you look up to them and you think that you can also succeed. You know, if you are the only person in that space, you're invisible, you're kind of a target, you're ignored. But if a person has a mentor, someone who stands beside them, supporting them, pushing them along, you know, that mentor doesn't have to necessarily be match the same identity as the individual. But if an individual has good mentors that are exposed to a number of things that's helpful, it's great to have that relationship with the student, and that will help to keep the student on track. And so oftentimes we lose track of students because no one is keeping their eye on them. But if a mentor was focused on the students, if the students experience any challenges, they could talk to that mentor, and that mentor can keep an eye on that student and make sure that the student continues in their education.
I think the first step is if people can remove the bias that they have, that will make a big difference because if their biases are present, it's going to get in the way of them being able to support the students. So that is a way for these barriers to be dismantled.
I'd also like to comment. I do remember chatting with one Black man a while ago. We were just talking about um,
Certificate.
certificates and not earning a diploma, but those
Mhm.
students receiving a certificate for graduation. And I'm like, what? Really? That's what happens? Some of those students may receive a diploma later, but maybe not. And I'm like, why would a school do that? Why would they give them a certificate? That's something that needs to stop. You know, we need to take responsibility. And as was mentioned before, having mentors for the students, having someone to lift them up and support them throughout this process, making sure that we don't lose track of them.
All right, next question. In predominantly white institutions that are established in many different places, many of these professors are white and perpetuate their white ideals. So, how do we address that?
I identify myself as a Black deaf professor, and I would say for me, from my perspective, I need to feel safe. I need to feel that that school, even though it's a white rural school, maybe I might feel like my culture, my race may or may not be honored in that space. I have to think about the values that I have. Are they committed to anti racism? Are there efforts to do so? I have to consider the community around me. Will the community foster my development? And I'm thinking for me, that may not work because my mental health is most important. I have to feel safe when I am instructing students.
Related to what the future doctor at English said, in terms of these rural schools, we have to think about tokenism because that's very dangerous. We have to make sure there's a safe environment and that we intentionally are showing love to the students. And if that doesn't happen, then it's no good.
I would agree 100%. I think about myself as the first Black deaf professor at the school in the Midwest. That was back in 2012, 2013, around that time. And so, the school had been established 25 years before I joined, and I was the first Black deaf instructor. I left that school because I didn't see the school hiring others that looked like me, and I didn't feel safe in that environment. When you are instructing and when you think about recruitment, you have to look at who's being recruited. And then you don't want to be the one to take the brunt of everything and work with them while they resolve the problems. Sometimes you have to address your own biases, look within yourself, look at those unconscious or conscious things that you share, working with your particular organizations and things that need to be changed within your organization. Is that particular university system willing to listen to the challenges that you're facing and that you're experiencing? Are they willing to address your issues to make the environment welcoming for Black individuals? If they are willing to do so, then okay. But if they're not, don't take the work. Don't expect that it's going to happen right away just because you've joined the faculty.
We have a question from an anonymous attendant, and that attendee specifically has a question for Dr. Gloshanda and says, I'm curious to learn more about your experience as an independent researcher as compared to doing research within a university setting or other institution. What has your experience been like being independent as opposed to under the auspices of a university?
This is Dr. Lori speaking. I've had less frustrations and challenges, but thinking about the funding, that's one area that's different. When I think about my research, I am self-funded. And so I bring in other deaf interpreters to um, produce the content in sign language. And so, of course, when you're working under an institution, you have access to their funding. But again, they may not always support the diversity in the work that you're trying to do, may not always welcome the perspectives that you want to share. And so if I want to have those individuals involved in my work, because I'm independent, I'm freer, I can flex the way I'd like to in the space, research on the things that are of most interest to me, bring in members of community that I want to incorporate in my process. I don't have the institution looking at me, wanting me to do what they want to do. But as an independent researcher, I can figure out how I want to make things happen. But of course, there is also a struggle with having access to resources.
I'm sad to say our time has come to a close, and this conversation has just started. We know that we've only begun with the work. We will continue this dialogue related to all of the isms, and we could continue this conversation all day and night for several days, of course. Thank you to each of you all, our scholars, our panelists, for sharing your perspectives and your honest truths. And we also know that there are other pieces of the conversation that still have yet to be presenced. And we've got some brief announcements. If you wouldn't mind sharing the PowerPoint, please. Please make sure you save the date. You can submit your questions through our center. If you have further questions, feel free to submit them to us. And also that in September, we are going to have another event that will talk about our Deaf Latin experience, overcoming obstacles and optimizing opportunities. And we will be partnering with the Center for Latin Studies and have our conversation in conjunction with Dr. Franklin Torres. So we will invite Dr. Torres to come in to host that webinar and partnering him, and there will be a panel. We hope to actually have this to be a hybrid event where you'll be able to be with us in person as well as online. And that will be on September 18th. So keep your eyes out for that particular event. It'll be available on our social media channel, and it will be available to you all to participate as well. Next slide, please. We're going to close now to share with you this notion that together we thrive. Thank you. Thank you.